and protect them. And so there were even Gentiles realizing the authority that the Jews had and were converting to Judaism in order to protect themselves. And so rather than worrying, these people were trusting God and realizing that they had a future because there was a God that loved them and cared about them. So we can make plans and we can trust God. And thirdly here, we can do what God clearly directs us to do. And so the Jews turned the tables now as we start into verse 9. And they're able to do that for a couple of reasons. In verses 1 and 2, in the 12th month, that is the month of Adar, so now we've jumped forward several months now, on the 13th day, when the king's word and law had reached the point for them to be done, on the day when the enemies of the Jews hoped to gain power over them, it was turned around so that the Jews themselves gained power over those who hated them. The Jews assembled in their cities throughout all the provinces of King Ahasuerus to send forth their hand against those who sought their calamity, and no one could stand before them, for the dread of them had fallen on all the peoples. So God put the fear of the Jews into the hearts of their enemies because they knew that they could not overpower God. That was planted by the Lord there to protect his people. In verse 3, even all the princes of the provinces, the satraps, the governors, and those who were doing the king's work advanced the Jews because the dread of Mordecai had fallen on all of them. So now everybody's kind of backed off of that, wanting to attack, and they're backing the Jews. Indeed, Mordecai was great in the king's house. The report about him went throughout all the provinces, for the man Mordecai became greater and greater throughout this time period. So they had government help because of Mordecai's authority. And so God blessed the work of Mordecai over the past 9 months. Everyone knew who he was. They feared him. And so the fear that God puts in their hearts, the fear that they had of Mordecai, caused the authorities now to be backing the Jewish people. And in verse 5, it says, thus the Jews struck all their enemies with the sword, killing and causing them to perish. And they did what they pleased to those who hated them. And at the citadel in Susa, the Jews killed and caused to perish 500 men. And Parshandatha, Dalphon, Aspatha, Poratha, Adalia, Aridatha, Parmashta, Arisai, Aridai, and Vizatha, the 10 sons of Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Jews' adversary, but they did not send forth their hand for the plunder. So there you see the death of all of Haman's sons, who are named here in the Word of God. So the Jews had their way because they followed the lead of God. They followed God's leaders. About 500 died in the capital city. That's a great number because these cities weren't huge like the cities are that we have today. So that was a good number of people that still, in knowing the king's edict, still wanted to kill the Jews. There was that much hatred there. Some of them probably were Haman's sons that were still trying to kill the Jewish people. But unlike Haman, they were not doing this for the money. 3 times here it states that they did not lay hands on the plunder. It wasn't about what they could gain. It was about their obedience to the Lord and the survival of the nation, the survival of the people. Verse 11, on that day, the number of those who were killed at the citadel in Susa came to the king. So the king said to Queen Esther, the Jews have killed and caused to perish 500 men and the 10 sons of Haman at the citadel in Susa. Now in the rest of the king's provinces, what have they done? So what is your petition? It shall be given to you. And what is your further quest? It shall be done for you. Then Esther said, if it is good to the king, let tomorrow also be given to the Jews who are in Susa to do according to the law for today. And let Haman's 10 sons be hanged on the gallows. So the king said that it should be done so. And a law was given in Susa, and Haman's 10 sons were hanged. And the Jews who were in Susa assembled also on the 14th day of the month of Adar and killed 300 men in Susa, but they did not send forth their hand for the plunder. And there's that statement again, they're not doing this for the money or what they could gain. It was more about a purging and a defense of the nation of Israel. And so Esther asks that another day could be granted so that they could purge the rest of those that still hated the Jews, or a good number of them, another 300. So that's 800 total now in the capital city, in the citadel. And now Haman's sons are hung as their father was, impaled on large poles so that the entire world could see that there is no fighting God's people. And in verse 17, now the rest of the Jews who were in the king's provinces assembled to make a stand for their lives and obtain rest for themselves from their enemies, and to kill 75,000 of those who hated them. But they did not send forth their hand for the plunder. Again, that's stated, the Jews were not in this for the money. They were in this for the preservation of the nation. This was done on the 13th day of the month of Adar, and on the 14th day they rested and made a day of feasting and gladness. So why didn't they kill more on the 14th day, do you think? Well, it's because they didn't know what Esther's request was. That wasn't possible. Again, no communication. So they only killed on the 13th day, but yet Esther requested a second day in the month of Adar in the city of Susa, the citadel. But they had on the 14th day, it says here, a day of feasting and gladness, a day of feasting and gladness. And so they were overjoyed at what God was doing. This would have been March of 473 BC. So just about 11 months after the original edict was put out by the king in the month of Adar. There was about 800 in those 2 days killed in Susa, about 75,000 in the rest of the kingdom that rose up against the Jews and were killed. And so that's just about almost 76,000 people that were killed because of their uprising over the Jewish people. So God's people can't overturn the king's edict, but we can work with God and fulfill what God desires for us to do. So what should we do? Well, what we have to get away from is that self-centered thinking that Haman had, and that self-centered culture, and we have to start thinking about God and what God wants us to think and the way God wants us to think, and how deliverance comes from God rather than from ourselves, which is what the gospel is all about. It's not about ourselves, it's about what God has done for us. So let's talk about the days of worship that are established here in verses 18 and 19. But the Jews who were in Susa assembled on the 13th and the 14th day of the same month, and they rested on the 15th day and made it a day of feasting and gladness. Therefore, the Jews of the rural areas who live in the rural towns make the 14th day of the month of Adar a holiday for gladness and feasting and sending portions of food to another. Whereas in Susa, they made the 15th day the day of feasting and gladness. So that's a time of remembrance that the Jewish people celebrated after that, celebrating the deliverance of God. In verse 20, it describes it further. Then Mordecai wrote down these events. He sent letters to all the Jews who were in all the provinces of King Ahasuerus, both near and far, to establish among them to celebrate the 14th day of the month of Adar and the 15th day of the same month annually, because on those days the Jews obtained rest for themselves from their enemies, and it was a month which was turned around for them from sorrow to gladness, from mourning into a holiday, that they should make them days of feasting and gladness and sending portions of food to one another and gifts to the poor. Thus the Jews the Jews fully accepted what they had started to do and what Mordecai had written down. For Haman, the son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the adversary of the Jews, had devised against the Jews to cause them to perish and had cast pur, that is the lot, to perish. King, that his evil scheme, which he had devised against the Jews, should return on his own head, and that he and his sons should be hanged on the gallows. Therefore, they called these days Purim, after the name of Pur. Therefore, because of the words in this letter, both what they had seen in this regard and what had reached them, the Jews established and accepted a custom for themselves and for their seed and for all those who joined themselves to them, so that celebrating these 2 days according to what was written down and according to their fixed time from year to year would not pass away. So these days were to be remembered and celebrated throughout every generation, every family, every province, every city. Thus these days of Purim were not to pass away from among the Jews, nor their memory come to an end from their seed. So they would feast, they would give presents to one another and to the poor. Now this is not part of the Mosaic law, but was initiated by Mordecai. It was called the days of Purim because Haman had cast pur, or lots. But God sovereignly used all of these circumstances to deliver his people, and they would celebrate that, how that happened. Then Queen Esther, daughter of Abihail, with Mordecai, the Jew, wrote with full authority to establish this second letter about Purim. And he sent letters to all the Jews to the 127 provinces of the kingdom of Ahasuerus, namely words of peace and truth, to establish these days of Purim at their appointed times, just as Mordecai the Jew and Queen Esther had established for them, and just as they had established for themselves and for their seed, with words concerning their times of fasting and their crying out. And the declaration of Esther established these words concerning Purim, and it was written in the book. So Esther writes her own letter with Mordecai to confirm all the feast of Purim, so that this wasn't done unilaterally by just Mordecai the Jew, but by Esther as well. Fasting and crying out are added. They're not in some of the older manuscripts. But this too was recorded in Persian history, these events. So this is not just a biblical record. And then the last 3 verses here are days of worship that are maintained because of what had taken place. Then King Ahasuerus set forced labor upon the land and the coastlands of the sea. And so this is the king's, earthly king's power, the widespread authority of the king, Ahasuerus, and the entire work of his authority and his might, and the full account of the greatness of Mordecai, whom the king had made so great. Are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of the kings of Media and Persia? So these records are recorded in extra-biblical content, extra-biblical records. For Mordecai the Jew was second only to King Ahasuerus, and was great among the Jews and pleasing to his many fellow brothers, one who sought the good of his people and one who spoke for the peace of all his seed. So Mordecai the Jew, it's interesting that he's mentioned as Mordecai the Jew several times in this book. That way there was never any doubt. If there was parts of the record that were ever lost, it was always recorded that Mordecai was a Jew. Esther, not as much as Mordecai. But he was a great patriot for the nation of Israel. He spoke on behalf of God's chosen people. Nowhere in this book, of course, does it say that Mordecai was a godly man. Nowhere here does it say he was a man of God, nor that he ever prayed. But he was a staunch defender of the nation of Israel. God raised him up to protect the nation when they were most vulnerable in captivity. And he did. He did it well. And God blessed him. He blessed his courage. He blessed his efforts by giving him great power in a secular kingdom, similar to a man that we know was a very godly man that did it also previously, before Mordecai, Daniel. Daniel was a very godly man in a secular culture, and Mordecai followed in his footsteps, but there's just no record of that given in the book of Esther. I'm sure he was connected in some way with the Lord and having full knowledge of the nation's need to be protected. So let's conclude with these thoughts. God's work in Esther, though he is verbally invisible. Let's talk about what we see here. Number one, under the conclusion, a Persian queen is deposed so that a Jewish queen could be positioned to speak on behalf of her people. That was an act of God. That was not just a dumb luck accident that took place. That was God working, where the very favored Persian queen is deposed, and then because of Mordecai putting his cousin in position to be successful, Esther is chosen as queen. Secondly, here, through a series of bizarre circumstances, Haman is brought low and killed, and Mordecai is exalted and honored. So again, man couldn't hardly orchestrate all of this. Only God could do that, to where the very gallows that Haman built for Mordecai, he was hung on. And then thirdly, a decree to wipe out the Jews is countered by a second decree that wipes out nearly 76,000 enemies of the Jews in 2 days. And so these are all amazing events that only God could fulfill, even though he's not mentioned by name. And this book really should be an inspiration to all of us, not just because it's a beautiful love story or it's a beautiful picture of people that were in captivity but yet were faithful to the Lord. I'm not so sure they were that faithful to the Lord, but they did what God wanted them to do at that particular time in the situation that they were in. And this should inspire all of God's people to worship and serve him in whatever circumstance we're in whatever nation we live under whatever government we're under, because God is sovereign and he has sovereign control over all of life's circumstances. He's sovereignly in control over where we live. He's sovereignly in control over our political leaders. And so this causes us to want to worship him and serve him and be faithful to him in our lives. So the Jewish people had wandered away from the Lord. They had left their worship of the Lord properly. They were taken into captivity by the Babylonians and then eventually by the Persians. And it took near annihilation to get their attention, to really get their attention to look back to God. Similarly, we can wander from God, and God may have to use tragic circumstances to draw us back. It's not outside of his bounds of love to use whatever means necessary to get our attention. And so whatever God uses, whether we are in rebellion or trial, we can remember the story of Esther and how God sovereignly delivered his people, and he can deliver us as well. Our focus shouldn't be on our outward circumstances, but our focus should be on our inward connection to our God, to our Messiah, through Jesus Christ. So that wraps up the book of Esther there in those last chapter and a half there, or chapter 10 is only 3 verses, but are there any questions on that, what we looked through in the last few weeks? Okay, we good, Chad?